Hello everyone. In this video I want to give a damage recap or kind of damage overview for my 30-pound combat robot Crippling Depression as a result from getting second place at Motorama in 2018. In this video I'm just going to kind of do a full teardown and show you everything that got damaged, which was most likely quite a bit. So let's start tearing this thing apart and see what all happened. So here is what Crippling Depression looks like in its current state right now. It is pretty beat up, and I will admit I already did kind of take a couple things apart. Pete of 60 Seconds to Glory did come over and we kind of took a couple things apart because he wanted to see what was wrong with it. So there's already some disassembly, but I'll get into that later. The weapon is sitting here on top. It's not fully attached, so let's start out by talking about the weapon a little bit. Just slide this over. This is the medium tooth weapon that I have. I have 3 full weapons for this robot, and this is the medium tooth, and this is what I used primarily the whole competition. I did end up using my bigger tooth, and that was against Huge, but that actually really wasn't that long of a match, and I didn't sustain much damage. But if we take a look at this weapon, it's actually not too bad. There's a little bit of damage on the tip here, really not too bad. There's a couple little nicks right there and there on the inside. You can't feel this, but it's actually quite sharp. And then there's a nick right there where someone might have gotten me. But other than that, the rest of this is just paint. I could sand this down and it would look just fine. So no real damage to the weapon disc, which is pretty cool. If we look at everything from the outside, you can see that there's substantial damage, and most of this actually came from 2 matches. It came from Megatron. That was all this and this, all the top-down damage, and then everything up front. So let me see if I can do this. All the front damage here, here, and here, this was all from Burnout, which was a horizontal disc spinner, which obviously got me all along this front. So that's really where the majority of the damage happened. If you take all of this damage away and the damage from the top right there and there really isn't that much going on here. So let me start with this top plate because this actually suffered a lot of damage. For those of you that don't remember or aren't keeping track, the top and bottom plates here are grade 5 titanium 6AL4V, and they're really strong. I mean, this is really strong stuff, and you could see that it has a full puncture right through there, and then this is kind of flared out, and then this one was bent in like that. I think I might do away with some of the vents in the next one, but largely there for some weight savings. But this doesn't lay even remotely flat. It's pretty well beat up, so that's what happened to the top plate. And if you watch the fight videos, I'll link to that below. Megatron has this kind of overhead saw, so what happened was he came down with the overhead weapon, and you can see it was spinning this way. So it came down, gouged this out, and then in another hit, it actually came down this way and pulled it in like that. And if you look beneath these holes, you can see that it nicked the frame right there from that hit and almost got a wheel. I think there might be some damage on this wheel. Yeah, just a little bit of a cut into the wheel right there. So that hit was actually pretty nasty and actually got a little bit of the drive pod. Here in the back, he actually missed a lot of really critical components. He could have very easily hit one of the ESCs or caught any of these, but it just kind of glanced off the back here and then cut into there. So not too bad. The aluminum did what it was supposed to do, is absorbing the impact, and the titanium kind of was supposed to deflect the hit, but it did not. So I flipped everything over, and here's where things get a little interesting. If you watch the fight videos, when I fought Huge, I was actually fighting upside down in this configuration with the weapon spinning up top like that, because it has kind of an overhead weapon, so I was using this to protect myself. And if you look over here in the corner, you can see what Huge's weapon did to me. It just kind of took out this whole chunk of the frame. So really not that big of a deal. That was not too bad. I was okay with that, but still pretty interesting that it just fractured this whole corner out. Now, this is where things get a little confusing. If we look at this spot right here, you can see that it's pretty well scraped in. You can feel there's a little ridge right here, and it actually bows in right there. And there's definitely a rub pattern here, and you can see some heat marks around the outside. And if we take this off, I'll show you what it looks like on the underneath side. So here's what it looks like on the underneath side, and if anyone's familiar with electronics, you can probably identify this. This is, you know, some electronic burning that happened. So in the very last match of the competition, the final, I was fighting Megatron for the second time again, and I was fighting, you know, normal side, so the weapon was down against the ground. And towards the end of the match, I realized that I stopped having control of the drive system. The drive system really wasn't responding. Everything was just kind of twitchy and kind of coming in and out of control. And this is the reason why. So I know what happened, but I'm not sure what caused it. So what happened here is something ended up rubbing, I mean the weapon ended up rubbing against this. I'm not sure why it got bowed out the way it did, but the weapon was rubbing against this, most likely caused a lot of heat. And then my signal wires, you can see here, the signal wires were riding against that bottom plate all the way along the bottom, and they got pretty fried. You can see this one actually looks okay, but has a little bit of charring on it. And then where's my other one? And there is the other one. And these are almost clean through. This one's the worst by far. The wire here is completely exposed. Not sure if you can see that on camera, but this wire is completely exposed. And these were just kind of wrapped together and actually melted together. So I'm really not sure which one happened first, you know, chicken and egg. Did these actually heat up and then fry and then end up sparking to create this problem? Or was it rubbing against it? That created it to heat up. That's what created the jacket to melt. So I'm not really sure which one came first, but for the next version, this is all going to be wrapped in heat tape, and that's going to be gotten rid of. But that was kind of interesting the way this all happened. Rubbing against this plate really isn't that big of a deal, and it's going to happen as close as my tolerances are, but I thought that it was interesting that it was enough to actually melt through all of this jacket and actually cause the drive issues. These two wires are for the left and the right drive ESCs, so that is interesting, and that right there is the reason why Crippling Depression had to tap out and why I ended up losing the final. So pretty interesting, just the wires. It also got hot enough inside of here. These wires got, you know, really toasty, and you can see maybe on the corner here, it actually melted this plastic. So that was really interesting. So the next thing I want to look at is the actual drive system. I want to remove these cups, see if the motors are good, and see how this whole section looks. So let me take these off. Okay, as we can see, these are all actually nice and lined up. Everything is smooth. I don't have any issues with any of this binding up, which is really nice. Part of the design behind Crippling Depression is I should never lose drive other than, you know, issues with the wires or something like that, because it's really hard to buckle or bind any of the drive system. So I think that still proves to be the case here. This one's actually pretty good. This one is slightly loose, so not a big deal, just a little bit loose, so I'm okay with that. Let's move on to this weapon hub. During the competition, I had very few issues with the weapon. Thankfully, again, I didn't really have any issues with that. However, when I took this apart at the very end, I noticed something. If we take this out, you can see one of the bearings here is okay. The other bearing isn't here, because it's actually in pieces. It just completely fell apart when I took it out. All the rollers came out, and upon further inspection, there's nothing wrong with the bearing. There's no damage to it whatsoever. It just looks like it just snapped apart. So that's kind of interesting. This is the bearing that was actually here, not on the other side of it. This was the bearing that was right at the bottom of the hub right there. And it just seems like it kind of snapped apart and, you know, completely fell apart into the components. So that's actually kind of interesting. And then I looked at the hub a little bit more, and if I grab the center bolt, this is the center bolt that goes through the middle, this no longer fits, and it's really hard to see here on camera. Let me move this away. There's something kind of odd about it. I put this on my lathe and it is no longer concentric at all. It's kind of wobbly. I don't really know what it is. I think what happened is this piece and this piece, they're all one piece, but I think they're kind of off-centered. So when you spin it, it's concentric, but it kind of goes like this around. So it's actually still perpendicular, but I guess not concentric. So this will actually need to be remade, which I'm not too thrilled about. I didn't think with this being milled out of a solid chunk of aluminum I'd really have any issues, but I did end up having some issues. However, when everything is fully put back together, the weapon actually still spins and everything is still pretty free spinning and feels okay. It's just really, really tight getting everything in and out. So that was just interesting. I'm not really sure what I'm going to do about that, but this hub is unfortunately trashed. Looking further into the actual weapon block, I don't really see any issues whatsoever. Inside here, the bearing race is still free and that all looks good. The idler setups are still really free and actually feel really smooth, so there's no issue there. I have just a little bit of belt dust in here, but other than that, that's fine. And if I put the belt there, I think both of the motors, yep, both of the motors are fine. I think this one feels a little bit loose. This one also feels a little bit loose. I'll have to take these pulleys off and check the mounts, but those tend to loosen up a little bit, so I'm just getting a little bit of looseness from the motor, but that just needs to be tightened. So this whole section looks really good. Later in this video, I'll take this all apart and I want to see how the dowel pins fared, because this whole thing takes a lot of shock back and forth from the weapon. So I want to see how the interface is between these rails and this weapon block. So let's move on to this front piece. If you look closely along this front seam, well, that shouldn't happen. There shouldn't be this much of a gap. There should be a little gap, I think about 10, maybe 20 thou gap right here, but you can see that this is kind of starting to separate out a little bit, so there's a little bit of a gap there. There's definitely a gap forming here, and then a huge gap right here where this whole front panel was kind of shoved out, or this whole thing was shoved sideways. And if we look at it from the top, you can see that it was the big hit from Megatron that actually pulled this out. It completely pulled it out. And if we look down in there, you can see that the dowel pins actually held in, but it actually separated out the aluminum. So the aluminum was the weak point. And if I look in my hardware bin here, so these screws were actually going completely through from here into there, so they hold like that. And I actually found that they fully pulled out, and the holes that were tapped inside of here are now completely smooth. So it just pulled the threads right out of it. So that was actually pretty impressive. I didn't really expect that to happen, and there's really no good way around that. And if we look at the side, over here, let me see if it focuses, cool. We've got dowel pins here and there. This dowel pin is pretty much completely gone. I don't really see it, but it's still embedded in here. This dowel pin is still in there, but it has been completely separated free from everything. So a couple really big hits caused that. And there was a really big hit from Burnout that actually took this whole side plate and mashed it out, and it actually broke free a lot of the countersinks. So let me show you those. So if we look on this side, you can see that the screw heads are, you know, pretty close to flush. But if we flip this over on the other side, you can see that these actually sit really far down. And the reason is one really big hit came along like this, popped this whole panel up, and the counter bores, sorry, not countersinks, counter bores, actually popped straight through this piece of aluminum. So much so that here is a piece of the aluminum right here. This little ring was actually on the back side of this hole. I'll show you that later, but it actually popped the cap of the socket head screw straight through this panel. So I'm going to need to make that wall thickness a lot thicker because it just popped it right out. The next thing I'm going to do is remove all the electronics here just so I can get all of this out of the way and then start looking at the frame and the structure. I realize that a lot of things got screwed up. I just kind of want to look at it firsthand and see what happened. So I'm going to go remove all the electronics now. Now that the electronics are free, I'm just going to start disassembling everything and seeing what issues there are. So that screw is completely gone. It just completely snapped off. I don't know how much further it went inside there, but that's kind of interesting. I'm actually really glad I'm filming this because I didn't expect some of this. I'll get a close-up shot of this later. Let me set this aside. This screw is just awesome. Look at that. It is just completely tweaked. So that's pretty cool. On the last version of Crippling Depression, I had an issue with these getting all bent up because I wasn't using the dowel pin, so all the force was going kind of right into these. 3 of these are totally good. There's no issue with these whatsoever. These 3 are fine. This one is just all out of whack. That is fun. The other thing that is amazing, this is amazing to me. This is a hardened steel dowel pin. And this is only, I think, 5/8 inch long, half an inch long. It is a very short dowel pin, and it is into aluminum, and you can see it is just bent. And that is really difficult to do for a dowel pin in that small of a size. So that is really, really impressive. And this other one is also equally bent. Let me roll it here. So that is pretty cool. It's like a little V now. And I'll get a close-up shot of this that it was going into and this to give you a better idea of just exactly what happened. These dowel pins actually look good, and that one is good. These holes are maybe a little bit loose, but they're actually not too bad. This was from the back side right there, and that actually mates up pretty clean, but this whole front is just really screwed up. So let me get a couple close-ups on these 2 things. So here's a close-up of where the dowel pins lived. This was their home, and their home got pretty well trashed. So one of the dowel pins actually fit inside there, and you can see the hole is just completely gone, and this is where the screw head went into that piece. So that screw head got sheared. This one looks, relatively okay. And then if we look at the mating component, let me see if it still focuses okay. You can see that this whole thing is just completely bowed out. It's cracked. It's really hard to see the contour of it from here, but yeah, this whole kind of section is just cracked out, so that's really, really interesting. So if you want to see what 30-pound combat robots can do, this is what they can do. These are solid 5/8 inch thick 6061 aluminum, and it just got trashed, so it's pretty cool. Before I take a look inside the drive pods, I'm going to take off this other side, which shows a lot less damage, but I'm going to take this off, and then we can look at the drive pods and see if there's any damage inside of those. So looking at these, I don't really see anything too interesting. The dowel pins are kind of lodged in there, but they would come out with maybe a press or maybe just a little bit of pulling like this. So they look okay. The holes are like slightly enlarged. There's some threads pressed against the side of that inside hole. This all looks actually really good. But if we look right here and here, you can see what I was talking about earlier. The socket heads are supposed to stop right there, but they go pretty much all the way through, and this actually might fit. Yeah, so that's kind of fits on the inside. So this is what I was talking about, is these were the little lip that's keeping these screws in place, and it just kind of popped right off and popped straight through, actually on all 4 of these. To give a comparison, where's the other side? Here is what the holes are, well, kind of supposed to look like on the other side. So you can see these are a lot larger than what these are. So these just all got pressed out. And you can see on this one, if we focus, you can see on this one, it just completely popped straight out. So kind of interesting. Now it's time to take both the front and the back plate off, or the back plate and the front plate. So let's go ahead and take those off. So I forgot that this side over here was not attached anymore because these got the threads pulled out. So these were the screws. These are 1032s. And yeah, it really doesn't fit anymore. There actually are some threads in there, but it looks smooth. Yeah, the threads are kind of gone, and same with here. It just kind of goes in and out. It doesn't really stick in there. So yeah, the threads are completely trashed on both this one and that one, and this whole side is just kind of dented up really bad. So that's kind of strange. And then if we look at the actual plate here, you can see that is where it went completely through. It went right through there and then completely through the other side. So this actually sustained quite a bit of damage, and that's the dowel hole that got split out. So yeah, the front took quite a bit of damage, and the epoxy even shattered, which is really interesting. This is all epoxy just for some, I don't know, vibration damping, and also just to fill in weight. But it got shattered there and then completely broke out right there. So this back panel, other than this little gouge right there, looks pretty fine. No issues. The epoxy looks good. Everything else looks fine. Really nothing to talk about with this back panel at all. So obviously I didn't get hit from the back as much, so this looks okay. So no big surprise there. Okay, so 2 things left to look at really, the drive pods and then the mounting from the inner frame rails to the weapon block. I really hope that those dowel pins are still okay because I don't really want to have to remachine any of this stuff. So let's look inside the drive pods really quick and see how those fared. So I see no issues whatsoever. Everything looks good. Let me pull off the chain here and the sprockets. Yeah, everything's good. There's a little bit of wear on the tires. I need to replace the tires anyway. But everything looks good. I'm going to take off this snap ring and pull that out and see how the mounting looks. Cool, so this all looks good. I never showed this in any of the previous assembly videos, but this is a new part. Previously, the screw heads that mount the gearbox down here actually just went through the UHMW directly, but now I have this ring of titanium as a spacer, and so now the gearbox is nice and solid. So all of this looks fantastic. So I'm going to go ahead and flip this around to the other side, or actually I'm going to take off the gearbox because I want to fully remove this so I can take a look at the weapon block. So I'm going to disassemble this, flip it around, do the same thing. So while we're at it, here's a look at the Planetary Gear Box, and you can hear it is nice and smooth. No grinding, no issues with that whatsoever. So this is nice and smooth. And the mating motor, I don't really see any shavings or any issues with that. So this looks really nice. And here's the second gearbox. Nice and smooth, no issues whatsoever, and this all looks good as well. So I'd say the drive system doesn't really need any more tweaks, so that's pretty cool. Okay, so we are down to the inner frame of Crippling Depression, and it is really loose and really wobbly. So let's go take a look at this side. Got dowel pins are all falling out. That actually looks pretty okay. I mean, definitely loose, as you can see, but no real issues. So let's take these 3 screws out and see how the dowel holes look. Interesting. So everything looks okay. You can see that there's a little bit of something, let's say just something over on that side. The dowels definitely are a little bit loose inside of there, but nothing really too bad. For anyone wondering, this little hole right here, when the drive blocks get mounted, this screw actually comes kind of close to hitting that, so it's just kind of a relief hole for these long screws. That's all that is. So everything looks okay there. If we look up close here, I don't really see any issues, so this is good. I think that solved most of the issues from the last version. So then let's flip this around. These dowels are obviously very loose because they already came out. This whole thing suffered a lot of damage. Yeah, these look okay. They're just a little bit rounded, but they fit relatively tight in there. So I don't know, maybe I'll end up doing like a sleeve inside there. Typically with a dowel pin, you can do a sleeve if you're going into a softer material. So maybe I'll end up doing that. But everything else with this weapon block actually looks pretty good. Just a little bit of wobbling from the motors, but those just need to be tightened. I didn't tighten the motors at all the entirety of the competition, and one of these motors is actually the original motor, so a lot of this stuff has been going for 2 full competitions, so not too bad. I've always wanted to do this, is just line up all the pieces to Crippling Depression. I'm actually missing quite a few. I don't have like the big blocks in there and stuff. But anyway, here's what everything looks like when it's fully broken down on Crippling Depression. You can see nothing really looks all that new and pretty. So anyway, thanks for watching. Hopefully this gives you a little bit better idea of what kind of damage can go into a combat robot, especially at the 30-pound weight class. So yeah, check out some new videos coming up. You can check me out on Facebook, and you can also check me out on Patreon to support my channel or see the channels that I support. As always, thanks for watching.